If you're a big fan of movies, or honestly even just a casual fan of movies, you've probably still heard the discussion Christopher Nolan is bad at writing exposition. And there's certainly examples you could point to that talk about that.
He's the hangar on the west side of the
Just built a turnstile in that wall.
Data tried to look, they only used to.
Oh no, Russian missile station was over.
digging plutonium from the rubble.
CIA provides two.
I am not a Christopher Nolan stan. He is not my favorite director, although there are movies I really enjoy of his. However, I wanted to kind of offer a defense of this narrative a little bit, because I think that there's a bit more nuance that sometimes gets lost in this. I think something I constantly hear people say is, I like when a filmmaker trusts the audience to figure out the information instead of holds their hand throughout, and instead of just gives clunky information, will give the information in more subtle ways, which it's something I used to always say. I used to hate exposition when I was like 17, maybe just because it's a big word that I could say at 17, and in my head, I was impressing my friends by saying it. But, every time there was a moment where there was, even not even that clunky of exposition, I would still, in the parking lot of the theater say, oh yeah, there is this moment of exposition, as if I've just found a flaw in the movie. But then a couple years later, I started writing stuff. I wrote comedy sketches, I wrote feature-length screenplays, and I would show people my stuff, and I would often get met with, what was going on here? What was, I didn't understand, like, this scene, like, what was the character, why was the character doing this, what was going on? And I kind of realized there's a reason why exposition is a thing. And while clunky exposition and giving too much exposition is easily noticeable when watching a movie, I would argue not giving enough exposition is the worst possible outcome, because then as an audience member, you're just bored and have no idea what's going on and are confused. So there is the kind of interesting, contrast between those two, and it is a tough balance to come across, is how do you perfectly, how do you perfectly give exposition to the audience and give information to the audience? To me, there are three key ways you can fail at writing exposition. Way one is kind of the obvious one. It's clunky exposition. The audience realizes that, for example, we've all seen it watching a movie. Two characters are walking through the supermarket, and character one says, well, as you know, we used to be married 4 years ago before we decided to just be friends. And then, as an audience member, you're like, that's a weird thing to say when you're talking about cereal. Like, I think the writer just wanted us to know that information. Takes you out of the movie. That's the first way you can fail. The second way you can fail is by, not giving enough information. The audience is confused. Third way you can fail is by giving too much exposition, even if it's hidden well. Usually the way you hide it is, like, for example, in the heist movie, you have a character who does not know the plans of the heist in the room, so that way they can explain to that character how the heist is supposed to work, which also explains to the audience how it's supposed to work, which can be fun for a bit, but if it goes on for too long, it feels exposition dumpy, and at a certain point, it's just boring, because there's only so much you're going to be interested in how a heist is supposed to work before you want to just see how the heist works. But this is the issue with talking about bad when it comes to movies, is all of this stuff is completely subjective, which is, film is completely subjective, which is kind of why I sometimes have frustrations watching certain, like, especially on YouTube, it can be not great, of, certain people saying, well, this is bad because I didn't like it, whereas I think sometimes it's not necessarily bad, you just didn't like it. For example, that supermarket scene, it's totally possible that someone else watching it didn't even put two and two together that it was clunky exposition, and it worked for them. They bought in which case now they have a piece of information, and it's just in the back of their head, and it only took 2 lines to make it work. The same thing with if someone tries a very subtle way to get exposition across. Maybe some people did pick up on it, and they are aware of what's happening, and now they feel like they've earned the exposition with that, they've earned the information, and they don't feel like they've just been getting, they don't feel like they've gotten taken out of the movie. They feel, it makes you feel better when you're watching a movie, when you figure something like that out, and you still have the information to make the future scenes more interesting. And then finally, the third thing, which is an exposition dump. I used a heist example because sometimes those are fun, right? When someone's describing what a heist is, and here's how we're going to do it, like, those scenes are actually usually pretty entertaining, and usually one of the better parts of the movie is the explanation of the plan of the heist, because that's interesting. How are you going to rob this, super super well-defensed building? Well, okay, here's how we're going to do it. That's an interesting thing to go through. I mean, think about it this way. I listen to podcasts. I listen to podcasts about things that interest me. If it was something that didn't interest me, I probably wouldn't enjoy that podcast, which is, podcasts are very subjective, because if it's about a topic you like, you're probably going to like the podcast. If it's not about a topic you like, you're probably not going to like the podcast. All of that brings us back to Christopher Nolan. I guess that you could say that was the exposition dump of this video. What are Christopher Nolan's problems? What are the things that when people don't like aspects of his writing, what is the issue? Well, is it that he's clunky at writing exposition? A little, yeah, a little bit. I think about a scene in Memento where there was a character that basically just said, I'm only telling you this information because I know you're not going to remember it soon, so therefore I can tell it, and then goes on to exposition dump a bunch, which I'm like, okay, that took me out of the movie. It did. I then went on to enjoy the rest of Memento, really fun movie, but still, that is a moment you could point to. But I think it's fair to also say that it's possible we just notice those things a little bit more in Nolan movies as opposed to other movies because we know of the exposition narrative. If I watch a Steven Spielberg movie and there's a moment like that, it's totally possible I'll notice it while watching it as well, but then kind of just forget about it by the time the movie is over. Whereas for Nolan, I'm like, yep, there it is, another Nolan exposition thing, and it's taking up more of my brain bandwidth just because I'm already aware, of that notion going into a film. Totally possible. But still, it is something I do notice when I watch Nolan's movies. Again, that part is completely subjective and can work on some people and can work on other people, but I actually think the more interesting discussion to be had is the other aspect of exposition dumps, which is, of course, does he use too much exposition in his movies? Let's use Inception as an example. I rewatched that movie not too long ago when I was making my Christopher Nolan tier list, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's a really fun movie. It's a movie I like. It is basically all exposition. That is just what it is. There is a ton of exposition throughout that movie, but I enjoyed it. Well, why? What was how does that work? I thought exposition was always boring. Well, Nolan has kind of tried to do the impossible with his writing, which is make the most exciting part of his writing exposition, and he's pulled it off at times, which is something that's going to be really interesting for a certain group of people and really uninteresting for a different group of people. For example, when I'm watching Inception, I'm like, yeah, this is cool. Again, it is a heist movie, so they're describing how this stuff is going to work, which is interesting to me. Of how would you try to implant a memory in someone, or implant an idea in someone's head using this dream mechanism? How would you attempt to do that? And then learning about how the dream mechanism works, all of that stuff, I'm fascinated by. So even though I think the movie does a pretty good job at hiding the exposition and still creating stakes within scenes and character arcs within scenes and all of that good stuff that's very important and has interesting characters, all of that stuff. To me, my favorite part about that movie is actually the exposition, is learning what's going on about this stuff. I actually think the movie is better in the first half than the second half because I like the exposition. That's the most fun part for me. However, moving on to one of my least favorite Nolan movies, Tenet, it largely is doing the same stuff. Like it is. It's largely about here is this unique technology and here is this spy thriller thing that's going on, and we're going to spend most of the film talking about what we're going to try and do to use the technology to make things happen. I got bored by it. I wasn't as into this. To me, it wasn't quite as gripping of a story. The technology wasn't as interesting to me because I kind of understood it right away, right? You go into a room, it makes you go backwards. There's not that much more information you need out of the technology aspect of stuff. So a lot of the exposition was most about this, like the spy thriller side of things. If I had to say exactly what it was that caused me to dislike Tenet more, I'd probably say it was the character. Probably I would need to rewatch it to really give a strong opinion, but I think I just didn't really care about the character and their motivation, whereas I thought Inception had a really strong character motivation of what Leonardo DiCaprio's character wanted, and I think that's kind of what pulled that movie together. But I don't think it's the exposition was worse in Tenet. Maybe a little, like there was, the including my son line was a bit weird, sure, but I actually think that the point of both movies and the point of the exposition in both movies came from the same place. And if you're someone who loves Tenet, like I get that, because I liked Inception, so like it's kind of a similar idea. I don't think it's that weird. So, again, it's kind of, I feel like a lot of times when people talk about movies, they talk about either good or bad. And even in this, I'm talking about bad exposition versus good exposition. And I think there is something to the idea that if you are better at writing, exposition, a larger group of people will like that exposition and like those lines more, whereas if you're worse at it, a smaller group of people will like it and like that movie. And I think that all that is fair. I actually don't know if Nolan is that bad at writing exposition, because, again, he's literally written movies that are mostly exposition that I've enjoyed. So, while I think that there's definitely some clunkiness in it at times, and that's something he could work on, the reality is when you attempt a project like Tenet, to me, it just goes back to the core fundamental parts of storytelling are so important. Getting the audience to care about the main character and care that they accomplish their goal. And then, hopefully coming up with a technology that's so interesting, like, exploring through dreams, that people are going to be interested in that, in the dialogue there, that can work a little bit better. So is Nolan bad at writing exposition? Well, I wouldn't even phrase it that way. Does Nolan's exposition always work for me? No, it doesn't. But sometimes it really does, and I think that usually when the exposition doesn't work, it has more to do with the surrounding factors of the film, like in Tenet, than the actual exposition itself. That's how I view it. But those are my thoughts on this. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. What are your thoughts on this? Interesting discussion. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.